The Kate Daly Show.
Back here with you, Kate Daly Show. So glad to be with you today on a Thursday. And our guest is Thomas DiLorenzo from the Mises Institute. He is president of the Mises Institute. I love the Mises Institute and have had many guests throughout the years, Ron Paul, Lou Rockwell, Tom Woods, you name it, and really appreciate all the work that they do, the awareness that they do, and the education that they do, especially when it comes to monetary, especially when it comes to all of the things that really hit us in the pocketbook and our understanding of these things. All right. So, Thomas, back here with you, and let's talk about the Federal Reserve. What would you like people to understand about this? There is a bill Senator Lee put up to abolish the Federal Reserve, but as Milty was saying on the break, there's no summary yet. Thomas Massey put up the to abolish the board, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, what's going on with the Federal Reserve, and what could you see happening?
Well, to put it in a little bit of a historical perspective, the Fed, as it's called, is our fourth central bank in America. There were three of them before that. The first one was called Bank of North America. It inflated its currency so much that no one trusted it, and it lasted a year and a half. This was at the beginning of the Republic, and it was privatized. And then Alexander Hamilton championed the Bank of the United States. Well, we had that, a 20-year charter beginning in 1791. And it did what central banks do. It created boom and bust cycles, big deflation periods, big inflationary periods, lots of unemployment, corrupted politics. It was not rechartered. Then the War of 1812 came. They brought another bank back, second bank of the United States, did the same thing. It created a panic of 1819, which was America's first Great Depression. Corrupted politics again by providing cheap loans to favored politicians and that sort of thing. Andrew Jackson vetoed the rechartering of that. So we had three instances in our history of central banks being abolished. And then it wasn't another 75 or 80 years before the same banking interest primarily succeeded in politics in getting another government bank run by politicians in power, the Fed in 1913. And so we have a long history of what the Fed has done since then. And the academic literature, I was an economics professor for 40 years, and the literature says that it has made the economy far more unstable than it was before we had the Fed. And the dollar is worth about 3 cents of what it was in 1913. It's devalued about 97% of the dollar. And so that's, like I said, everything should be getting cheaper with all the technology we've got today. But the only reason it's not is the Fed keeps pumping more money into the system. And its main beneficiaries are the banking industry, real estate investors, speculators, and Wall Street speculators. That's who makes the big bucks from the Fed. But you and I suffer from these periodic ups and downs, big inflation, big depressions, and an overall inflation year after year after year.
Yeah.
And so, we have a history of abolishing the Fed.
Yeah, you're right. And so if this happens, then wouldn't it go to the U.S. Treasury, which could be worse? And what kind of solution? Whenever they want to get rid of something, they serve up a solution, and usually it's by the ghouls in the swamp. So I don't trust that the solution's going to be better. What say you, Thomas DiLorenzo?
Well, a sort of a middle of the road. The ideal thing would be go back to what the world did for several thousand years and have money that's based on precious metals like gold and silver. And so that instead of the promises of politicians, what is that worth to anybody? And so, but a middle of the road or a stepping stone toward that would be competing currencies, where you could allow banks to issue currencies backed with gold and silver, and then have a competition, see which becomes the most trustworthy. And the word Dixie, with the South is referred to Dixie, the land of Dixie.
Yeah.
The reason is that there was a currency called the Dix, D-I-X, 10 in French, and it was a 100% gold reserve bank in New Orleans, and it was so trustworthy that even people in Minnesota use this this is the 19th century, as their currency. And the whole South was using Dixie. That's why it's called the land of Dixie, the land of the Dix, the currency. And so we had many competing currencies like that in the 19th century before the Civil War. But there was legislation during the Lincoln administration that puts taxes on these currencies. They created the greenback dollar and created a sort of the monopoly money of the greenback dollar and drove the other currencies out of business. But that would be the way to go after the Fed is abolished, is to have a competition. And I would expect some states would do that. You wouldn't have to have the national government do everything. You could have a state or groups of states have their own currencies, and that would work much better than putting politicians in charge of a secret organization that has never been audited.
Oh, so true.
And in control of all the money.
That is so true.
Yeah, no, cities in the Old West the banks in those cities used to create their own currency and make agreements with the other cities to accept their currency. But
the problem now is that we have bought and paid for governors. So I don't see that happening, that they would lead out with the states. And so is this chatter about the Federal Reserve, because usually it's sort of not been touched a lot in the last, I would say, 56 years. So would this be in preparation for the digital tyranny coming?
Oh yeah, that would be a nightmare, because they could. You might remember the Canadian truckers who protested some of the COVID crackdowns in Canada, and they froze their bank accounts. And even people who supported the truckers on the radio or in the newspapers, they had their bank accounts frozen. And that's what some of our politicians would like to do with a digital currency. You know, if you criticize the government, the Homeland Security has invented a new term. It's called malinformation, and they define it as information that is true but might make the recipient of that information not trust the government. And they want to label people who disseminate malinformation as domestic terrorists.
Oh my God!
So don't tell the truth about government if it's bad. If it's bad, because people will distrust the government. And to me, that's patriotic. There's nothing more American than doing that. That's exactly what George Washington and Thomas Jefferson thought you should do as a good citizen. That's that sort of thing. But that's where we are. And of course, if they had a digital currency, that would be the tool that they would use to do that. So that would be a nightmare. I suspect what will happen maybe after I'm gone is that we'll see disunion in different states or groups of states seceding from the system and creating their own countries with some with more freedom and some with less. Kind of like what happened when the Soviet Union broke up. And at the beginning, Estonia was one of the freest countries in the old Soviet Empire, for example, and it's different today. But that's what I see happening in the future.
Oh, wow.
Sounds like malinformation to me.
Can you imagine they have to come up with all of these ways and terms to lie and deceive? It gets more amazing and baffling by the year, I'll tell you what. If people haven't figured out their government has been lying to them just about over everything, I don't know where to start with people. But there are trusting folks out there, and so if the U.S. Treasury takes this over, then what? Worse? Just as bad?
Well, that's typically what governments do, don't they? If they know the people don't want something, some regulatory agency or something like that. They'll say, okay, we will abolish this agency, and then they'll give all the functions of the agency to some other agency. And so they can have, that way they have it both ways. They keep all the power that they had, and they can brag, I abolished agency X, when they run for re-election. And although one counterexample of that, though, is the Civil Aeronautics Board. In the 70s, Jimmy Carter abolished the CAB, Civil Aeronautics Board, that made competition illegal in the airline business for 50 years. It was illegal to cut prices in the airline business for 50 years. And that was such a scam, and such a scam against the working class, that even Ted Kennedy and Ralph Nader were in favor of it back in the late 70s. And so we do have some examples of that, doing it the right way.
We're going to come right back. A few more minutes with Thomas DiLorenzo, president of the Mises Institute. Be right back. Kate Daly Show, katedalleyradio.com.